10 years since the war in Iraq. Next year sees British troops withdrawn from Afghanistan, and it provides a time perhaps for reflection, but not just to look on what's gone past, but also with the prospect of intervention in Syria, war with Iran looming, on what lessons can be learnt from past decisions when we look forward to the future. Well, to help us talk more about this, I'm joined by the former Deputy Prime Minister under Tony Blair, Lord Prescott. Thank you very much for joining us. We're talking about reflections here, 10 years on from the war in Iraq. What do you reflect 10 years on now? Did it turn out the way you expected it?
It certainly didn't. But then the important thing is, what did we go into Iraq for? Well, Saddam was an evil man, there's no doubt about that, but we're not the believer in regime change. You can't just go into another country and decide, I don't like its leader. Tony Blair had a very strong view that you should not stand aside when lots of people are being killed. But I was always insistent, when we discussed it, it did have to have the United Nations endorsement. And that's what Tony did hope to get. The matter about nuclear weapons, and he used to have them before Saddam, certainly wasn't there to be found there, and our intelligence was wrong. What worries me now, when I reflect in 10 years, is not so much how I came to be agreeing with Tony, and then the process of what changed, and it became regime change. In fact, when I talked to Vice President Cheney, when I was sent over to talk over there, I mean, this was a man who didn't care a damn what was going to happen about the UN. He just really wanted to go in Iraq. To their mind, President Bush, the father, had stopped at Kuwait and not gone in and dealt with Saddam. So all the Americans used to say to me, it's business as usual. And what they meant was basically unfinished business. So to that extent, I was very alarmed and told Blair that. Bring it forward now to the 10 years, and what begins to worry me all the more is it does seem, and Tony Blair is saying it, that in the case of Syria, or indeed in Iran, and I think it's implications in Mali, that their feeling is you go in then to do the same thing. Now that's just wrong. We're not learning the lessons of Iraq. It doesn't bring peace. Shock and awe might win militarily, but the weeks that follow cause an awful lot of deaths among civilians.
When we're talking about you now, with hindsight, saying that the war in Iraq was wrong, at what point did you reach that conclusion? At what point did you think it wasn't the right thing to do?
Well, the real problem is you're discussing whether you should go in. I came back and told Tony, the Americans are going in with or without. We don't make the difference. They're going in. And I said to Tony, therefore, it's almost regime change. But we were already into the war. The difficulty with the politicians, and remember, nearly 200 people of our own people died, quite apart from thousands and many thousands of civilians. Once you're in the war, you get behind your troops. You do not then have the arguments. But now it's 10 years on, and looking how I went through that process of change, I think it's right to say it now, not to clear my conscience, because I must accept the responsibilities for the part I played in that decision.
Do you? How do you come to accept that?
It's not very easy. People have died. How do you do it? Even if we only talk about British troops, it was nearly 200 of them, right? Or indeed the many thousands of civilians who continue to die, even today, in what is happening in Iraq. So it's not easy. You do the best to make your decisions.
Do you regret now that you didn't speak up louder and join people like Robin Cook in?
Hang on, Robin Cook actually allowed the Americans to bomb from UK bases in Iraq before, and that was without the UN. But I understand Robin's arguments, but basically looking back, I thought the decisions were right at each stage. There was another important factor in it. Bush promised to bring in a roadmap for Palestine and justice in Palestine. America's the only one that's likely to have any influence on the Israelis, right? And Bush went further than Clinton. He recognized the two-state system. And Tony Blair's out there still trying to achieve some of that. But the Americans failed in producing. So each stage, you look at it and you say, yes, I think it's worth doing. If we could settle Palestine, I'd do a lot of things to try and bring justice back for the Palestinians. It's a terrible situation we've got there. So each stage, and then the UN, Tony thought he could carry the Euro nations. Russia obviously was making clear she didn't want that, China as well. So to that extent, we didn't get the UN. Where Tony made that decision, the Americans made clear we could come out. I said they're going in without us anyway. But Tony Blair's not that kind of guy.
At this point, when we heard from Tony Blair, the then Prime Minister, he said this in the House of Commons, that he, Saddam Hussein, has existing and active military plans for the use of chemical and biological weapons which could be activated within 45 minutes. It's the famous speech that we heard. You at the time sat there in that video. He was Deputy Prime Minister at the time, his right-hand man.
Hang on. Intelligence given to us told us about the nuclear weapons, right? They did have nuclear weapons when the Israelis bombed the place and where they were developing them, so he used to have them. Secondly, he used gas, which I think is the 25th anniversary now, to kill thousands of Kurds. So he was a man for using weapons of mass destruction. He has a record of doing it. Basically an evil man. The question to me, though, is if the UN felt that, and he wasn't observing, by the way, there were 17 resolutions committed by the UN involving Russia supporting as well. So to that extent, there was a UN mandate. Tony felt you could act on that. What he couldn't get is the agreement that other Security Council would have a separate motion on intervention. He didn't get that, the UN failed. But the UN failed over Rwanda, it failed over Sierra Leone.
Well, I want to talk to you about Rwanda because you mentioned in your writing recently that you feel that that was in part what happened in Rwanda, a motivator maybe at the back of Tony Blair's mind when Iraq was happening, when that decision was being made, that he didn't want to have another situation where the world stood by to watch.
That's a critical fact. Yeah, he said that in his San Francisco speech. He's actually repeated it again since. I only talked to him 2 days ago. And I said, Tony, what you're saying in your speech, you should still be able to intervene. That is regime change, whatever it is. Who decides the goodie and the baddie? To him, it's if you're killing your own people, you don't have a right to turn and be oppressive with your own people. Where is the line drawn in that? But then he says, we won't send in troops, boots on the ground. Why? Because it's unpopular, leave out costly, same in America. Now they want to use these drones to bomb people out. They're killing more civilians in Pakistan than they are the alleged terrorists. So, you know, it's like we can now carry it so many thousands feet in the air and kill off who we want to kill off. I mean, when Obama was sitting there about bin Laden, and all it sat round in a table like a video game saying, kill him now. Jesus, where are we going?
You said you talked to Tony Blair just a few days ago about this. What are your conversations like now, 10 years on? What are the discussions?
Well, Tony's quite a generous man, really. He knows that. He knew my views when we were in government. But I'm a Deputy Prime Minister. I'm not doing the storming out and all that.
What does he say about you openly saying now that it was the wrong decision? How does he feel about that?
I said to him, look, I've said that, and you know this is my view, so it's no shock to him. But 10 years on, and I then say to him, you committed the same mistakes in your speech you've just made about Syria. So I just don't agree with you, Tony. And he doesn't hold any kind of problem with that.
What does he say in defence when you're talking about Syria?
His defence is quite clear, that no leader in the world has a right to kind of kill off its people, act in an oppressive way.
Do you feel, Tony Blair, because the British public very much feel that they were lied to over the war in Iraq, do you feel that you were lied to at the time as his Deputy Prime Minister?
Are you saying that when you read the intelligence information and it says that, do you accept it or not? How other can you say not? We know he had nuclear weapons before. We know that he actually used them against people, gas and weapons of mass destruction. We know he had all that. And the intelligence report said, yes, he still got them. And then that became the first shock when they couldn't find any of it. Not that he doesn't use them if he has them, and not even if he had them, the Israeli bombed it.
He didn't have them, they weren't found.
I know, but you didn't know that when you're looking at the paper. You get a report right in front of you, what are you going to say?
But that mistake cost hundreds of thousands of Iraqi lives.
Just duck behind the easy option there. You're asking me what I thought. I get an intelligence report that says he's still got what he's used before. So we know he's used them, it's not just making it up. And the intelligence report, with information given in that way, says that. Now, even then, I don't think you can unilaterally intervene without a UN resolution. That was a strong line always with mine. And Tony always felt he could get it, but he didn't get it, right? And he then could have pulled out if you want. That was a judgment for him to make. But once we'd gone in, You do not get into a bloody war politically when your own people are out on the front line, a very strong position.
As I'm saying, what I'm trying to get to is your motivation at the time this happened, because it's one thing to say now that you admit that it's wrong, but I think the problem is to prevent the mistakes being made again now.
But that's what I'm talking about.
You're talking about what happens behind the scenes in government. You know, what can happen now? What lessons can be learned from...
Well, I've told you. In fact, I've said to the people that, and that's why I've publicly come out to say that. I could easily say nothing. I'm not looking to be... You don't get liked for saying that, by the way, or having a decision wrong. You don't become popular overnight for that. But I am worried what's happening about Syria. They're going talking about Iran. It's almost the Crusades again. The Western superior values now have to be planted in these countries. I mean, at the end of the day, what are we doing now? We're providing bullet protection equipment for the rebels while the civilians are getting killed and being driven out of the country. And you cannot change it. Iraq teaches us, which they would thought, simply by getting rid of the leader doesn't bring a kind of peace and quiet. No, you've got religions that hate each other, different leaders come in, and that's in all these Mediterranean countries.
When you hear William Hague talking about arming the rebel groups and making sure that it gets into the right hands, what Britain...
Doing exactly the mistake. Well, there's certainly, in regard to Syria, there is UN resolutions to try and assist and help the revolution rather than get rid of Saddam, but effectively it's almost meaning the same, right? So what you've got is a kind of civil war going on between those. It's the center of what might happen in the Middle East. Well, in reality, we're going to have to live letting the people decide what they're going to do in Egypt, in Syria, in Libya. I mean, the interesting thing is Tony Blair got Gaddafi to drop his investment in nuclear. Would we invaded? Would the nations have gone in Libya if it had got the bomb? No. Because when they know, and the lesson is learned, like in Iran, if you want real security, have the bomb. And then we say, oh, if Iran has the bomb, they're going to Syria, they're going to these. Well, I'm afraid the Western view tends to be there are goodies and baddies with the bomb. Nobody was supposed to have the bomb after the agreements and the non-proliferation. India's got it, Pakistan's got it, North Korea seems to be having it, Israel we don't want to talk about, but they got a bomb. And so this hypocrisy to a certain extent, almost as I said in discussions with Tony and the cabinet, why is it then you're prepared to tolerate India and Pakistan having a bomb? Why is it everybody has to plead with China to go to North Korea and ask them to drop the bomb? Because you're arguing bomb brings power, influence, they know that in Russia as anywhere else.
We talked about reflections 10 years on from the war in Iraq. We're seeing troops be withdrawn from Afghanistan next year, and we've got obviously the talk of going in Syria on the table. Do you think this government is going to make the same mistakes that the previous governments have made?
I think there's a danger of doing that because it's motivated almost by the same things. Good people stick together. I'm afraid when you get into other countries, they're not necessarily good, they might well be bad. But you've just mentioned Afghanistan. That was the UN agreement. I saw all the intelligence reports to show where the bombers and the terrorists were operating from, and it was right. And they destroyed them. But that was with UN intervention. But we are any better off in Afghanistan? I just think you're after 10 years in Afghanistan now. Will it not go back to its old ways? It's certainly looking like it will. So the historical lesson is to avoid doing another crusades. We did that 1,000 years ago. Well, this time the crusade is without boots on the ground because the public are saying they don't want it. But then you go to technology, bomb them. And that still doesn't bring you peace and political stability.
Thank you very much for that.
Okay.